introduction about myself. I have been in the architecture and construction industry for about 14 years, mostly on the architecture side, but a little bit on the construction side as well. I've been working in sustainability in some sort of fashion for about the past 12 years. I've been on the board of the local USGBC North Texas chapter and was one of the founding members. I volunteered there for probably about 10 years. I dropped off a little bit ago to complete my master's degree in sustainability and development, and I'm actually about to start back up with my volunteer work there as well. I'm a member of the Congress for the New Urbanism. We'll talk a little bit about that organization here pretty shortly as well. So let's go ahead and get started on the presentation. So really what this presentation is about is an overview of sustainable development strategy. We're going to talk about some issues around sustainability and development, the impacts of development on ecosystem services. We're also going to talk about strategies to mitigate those impacts, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that are used to measure the sustainability of different developments. So a lot of us hear about green buildings all the time. Most of us are familiar with the U.S. Green Building Council's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design Program, LEED. LEED measures green buildings. One building at a time is the typical measure with building design and construction. And LEED buildings are great. Green buildings are great, but there's limitations to green buildings. So what we see here is the 2 LEED Platinum projects. The one here on the left is an energy headquarters, and you can see it's a platinum building, got wind turbines, but it's also off by itself. So when you're thinking about how those services infrastructure get to that building, there's a lot to get to it. We also have over here a LEED Platinum project, which is again, a wonderful building, but it's a very, very large house. So there's something that's also inherently unsustainable about that as well. We'll talk a little bit about that here throughout the course of the presentation. So what are the issues for sustainability and development? What are the drivers there? And one of the main impacts of development is going to be on something called ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are the services that nature provides to basically give people, all life on Earth, the services needed to survive. And so those services are going to be most commonly understood as provisioning services. So it's going to be food, fiber, fuel, the goods and services we use to build our buildings, to eat, to sustain ourselves, to drink. Those are going to be more the provisioning services. Then we also have regulating services, and those are not as commonly attributed to goods and services that we use on a daily basis, but basically it's cleaning our air, cleaning our water, disease mitigation, disease regulation. So those are the things that maybe not as on the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about ecosystem services. And then a little bit further kind of down the experiential line is where what you'd expect of ecosystem services are going to be more what are called cultural services, and that's going to be the spiritual benefits we get from being in nature, being in the environment, educational benefits of the environment, of ecosystems and those sorts of things. So those are just kind of the basics of the impacts of development, what development is impacting. And now we're going to look at, how are those ecosystem services impacted by development. So mainly we're going to talk about population and how population affects the services that are provided. So as you'll notice that this is mostly going to be geared toward North Texas. And I'm located in North Texas in Dallas, and a lot of my research has been surrounded in North Texas. However, every region, every area has its own specific issues. And a lot of them overlap. So when you think about expanding populations and you think about growth into the suburbs and exurbs and those sorts of things, then that can be somewhat universal. But what we're going to talk about here is North Texas, and there's different ways you can associate those to the area that you're in. So with North Texas, the North Central Texas Council of Governments has run population studies, projections over the course of time. So this graph is showing 2012 versus 2035. And you can see these areas of color, the darker pink and burgundy, are going to be where population existed in 2012, or basically where it is here in 2013 as well. And then this is the projected growth in 2035. And you can see that the growth is really out surrounding the Metroplex. So we have Dallas here, Fort Worth here, and a lot of growth into what's currently mostly agricultural lands right now. So this urban sprawl is going beyond what we've typically seen. And so what we see here is basically in 1940, what this area is where this growth is now, which is 75 north of Dallas. So you can see this was all just country and farmland, and now it's solid development. And so that's going further and further from the city center. So what this is spurring is a lot of habitat loss. Biodiversity is being lost. We're seeing a lot of wildlife in neighborhoods, so that we've had reports of bobcats and such preying on small animals and pets. So that's one aspect of it. We also have a loss of prime farmland. And what's really interesting about how cities have developed is that most cities have been developed around rich agricultural land, and that's especially true with Dallas and Fort Worth. Dallas is going to be more the cotton side of the Metroplex. We have the cotton and the ranchers, the farmers and the ranchers, and so Fort Worth is going to be more for ranching. But basically the population centers were developed around trade for these agricultural services. Well, as our population has grown and we've developed these areas, we've developed a lot of this prime farmland because these areas were located in the center of the most fertile areas for these crops. So basically what we have is our development is encroaching on the area that we're growing our food. And so the food that's been growing that's grown in the path of development, we have 91% of fruits and berries. We have 78% of vegetables and melons. A lot of our dairy and poultry, as well as our grains, are right in the path of development. And so this is creating a level of food insecurity for us, so that we actually have to bring in more food from further distances, and we have to use more fertilizers and insecticides to get our food to grow on the less fertile land. But this also comes a loss of habitat that causes stormwater issues and erosion. So we have clear cutting that clears the land of pretty much all vegetation and a lot of the topsoil, and then also comes through and doesn't allow anything to grow because all that fertile soil is now gone, removed for grading. So the stormwater no longer has a way to flow with the vegetation, and we have a lot of pavement that comes in, and that causes, especially in the North Texas area, where we have very clay-heavy soils, a lot of flash flooding because those soils don't absorb into the ground. So with flash floods, we have a lot of home damage, we have a lot of road damage, there's major erosion problems, and then there's also pollutants that run into our waterways, threatening our drinking water supplies. In addition to growing out into suburbs and exurbs, which are beyond suburbs, we have growing infrastructure needs. And infrastructure requires a lot of materials, it requires a lot of manpower, it requires a lot of energy, and all of that energy and manpower and those resources are going further and further out, when we could be using the resources that we already have in place in urban areas and suburban areas. We'll get a little bit more to that in a moment. So that infrastructure goes not just for roads, but also for water and wastewater, electrical lines, those sorts of things. Another aspect is that most development in this way going out is going to be designed around the automobile. And so when you have an automobile-oriented society, it's hard to see where the people fit in. So, I mean, you'd want to just picture yourself walking along this area, and there's really no pedestrian-friendly. If you were to walk through here, you would not feel comfortable. It would not be a place that you could feel necessarily safe and secure without being threatened by being hit by a car. So it's hard to see the human aspect of this when everything is geared towards automobiles. And it occurs to me that even if you're walking through a strip mall that's associated with a big box store, I remember one time I was going to a movie in a strip center, and we had some time before the movie started, so we decided to go for a walk and shop a little bit. And what occurred to me is as I was walking down the strip center is that there were no signs for the pedestrian to show what stores they were. I mean, there were a couple of stores where there weren't even signs on the windows. So I would have to walk into the store to see what store that is because it's so geared towards people pulling up in cars, shopping in that store, and leaving. Part of the problem that all this transportation and automobile-oriented development causes is air quality issues. And Dallas-Fort Worth has been in a non-compliant zone for EPA air quality for a good number of years now. And as much improvement as that as has been done in the area, as soon as standards are increased, we fall back out of compliance. So it's an ever-ending or never-ending cycle to try to reduce our air quality issues. Much of that air quality is due to on-road mobile vehicles. So we have 41% that's attributed to basically mostly single-occupancy vehicles, but also multi-occupancy, high-occupancy vehicles such as buses and HOV, that kind of thing. We also have 24% that's non-road mobile vehicles, which are going to be construction vehicles. A lot of those are for increasing the infrastructure to go out to further development. But there's also community pressures on development and these ecosystem services. And the community pressures in North Texas can be really universal with other areas as well. And what you see here is the North Central Texas Council of Government projections for traffic congestion. And what you can see is that for the lighter red is going to be moderate congestion, and the darker red is going to be heavier congestion. And we see that especially in these far north areas, which are going to be in, these are actually a good distance from the Metroplex. This is Dallas right here, and this is Fort Worth right here, and we can see a large amount of congestion going to the north. What's interesting about this study is that it assumes that there's rail everywhere, and there's still a great deal of congestion. Some of these rail lines are still not funded, so it's definitely just a projection on that aspect as well. At the same time, what's happening is in our inner ring suburbs, we have some suburban decay. This is actually from the Detroit area, but it's just an example of the type of suburban decay that can happen in these inner ring suburb areas. So obviously, Detroit has been very heavily hit by economy issues, and you can see that we have a lot of empty land. There's a lot of ideas about what can be done with that land. There's some urban agriculture proposals that would be useful, especially when you're talking about the loss of the prime farmland. But we also want to see how else we can redevelop these areas. Another problem with the North Texas region, and again, regions all across the U.S., is going to be our centralized power grid. And what this causes is several issues whenever it comes to security, having large centralized power generation facilities are a security target for attacks, let's say. When you're dealing with Middle East threats, that's probably going to be the least likely to happen. But we also see an 8% loss of energy just from the transmission of the power line. So when we have this large centralized power, we're losing at least 8% just to get it from the remote areas to the cities. We also have a lot of coal-fired power plants in North Texas, as well as natural gas-fired power plants. And there are carbon emissions and nitrous oxide that's being emitted from those that's contributing to the air quality issues. Another aspect of the community is going to be our aging population. So what you can see here is in 1990, there were fewer of older populations in the area, and by 2010, they're expecting to be more and more elderly populations. And then projected by 2030, you can see that this top area is showing a much larger number of the elderly in the area. And so that's going to affect the type of housing we're building, the needs of these populations. And then we also have obesity problems in the U.S. This is a study done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and you can see that we have obesity rates increasing from 1990 and then into 1999 and 2009. And this is actually since been updated, where Colorado is no longer in the 15 to 19% obesity range. They're now in the 20 to 24% obesity range. But you can see a lot of the South Central states here have obesity rates greater than or equal to 30% of the population, and that's increased enormously from 1990 to 2009 and then into 2012 and 2013. So how do we solve these problems? Because we can talk about problems all day long, but if you don't have solutions, then it doesn't help the situation. The first solution is really location, location, location. And that's, of course, the type of real estate line you hear all the time. It's very important where you locate your home, your business, whatever you're going to build. And the key to building development sustainably is to locate it in infill areas. So locate it where we already have this existing infrastructure, where we already have the existing population. And so this image comes from Wackerle DFW blog, and it's showing basically all the empty or vacant or underutilized properties in the Central Dallas Business District, and then also in the general vicinity around that. And so this is a huge opportunity when it comes to where to build with existing infrastructure, what's already there. There's already services there. There's already people there. And also then bringing more people into the area as the population is expected to grow. What this does is it decreases pressure on farmland and native habitat. So where we already have pasture land and native spaces, if we build in, we're not building out, and these places are going to be preserved. Farmland is a key piece of the puzzle we've talked about already. And we also want to build in transit-oriented areas. So we're basically transit-oriented development. So we're building near trains, near already planned transportation corridors, so that we can build on the system that's already there, so we can already use that existing infrastructure. And then we also want to think about how we develop, how we zone our areas. And so right now what we have is our typical zoning system in the United States is segregated zoning. So what we're seeing is zoning by use. It's called Euclidean zoning, based on the initial Supreme Court case that that ruled that this is appropriate. And so what you see is you have use-based zoning, so it's going to be, you have a residential area in one place, and then you have a commercial area in another area, and then you have industrial or retail, and so everything is really just kept apart from each other, and that's where it really encourages people to have to get in their car to drive to the grocery store, to the dry cleaner, to restaurants or shopping. So the Congress of the New Urbanism has proposed an alternative to this Euclidean zoning system, and that's going to be the SMART code. And the SMART code is developed around the natural transect, and it looks at nature to see how to organize the development. And so what you see here is various levels of density. And we have the back dune, and this example is from a coastal area, but we have the back dune, which is heavily dense, and then you have a secondary dune, which is slightly less, and then you have the trough, and so on until you have natural land, or this is actually going to be the start of any ecosystem. And so what we see here is how to develop our communities around this natural transect. And so what you have then are special districts, so that would be a hospital or any kind of industrial area. And then you have an urban core zone, which is going to be, a highly dense area with lots of different services. A lot of people probably attribute that to something like Chicago or Manhattan. And then you have more of an urban center zone. It's going to be a little less dense, more of your small towns, mixed uses, house with shops and living spaces above, and then some housing in there as well. And then a general urban zone, which is just, again, a little more of the residential, a little less of the commercial. The suburban, where it's going to be more of a residential aspect, fewer commercial as well, and rural, farming, and then a natural zone. So the way we see this happening is in this traditional neighborhood development pattern. So when we talk about the word density, there's a lot of, especially in North Texas, a lot of negative connotations. And so people think of, in North Texas, think of density as Manhattan. This is, we are not Manhattan. This is not who we are here. But we're not necessarily talking about density to this level. Downtown Dallas has some very tall buildings, and it's, somewhat similar to this, not on this scale. But it's not necessarily what we're going for. So then on the other scale of density, a lot of times when you talk about density in the North Texas area, people think of garden-style apartments. We don't want apartment complexes. There's going to be problems with transient populations, and so this is another way that people view density here and reject it. What we're really talking about when we're talking about density, though, is not necessarily either of those things. We're looking at more of a traditional neighborhood style. So again, you're going to have a centralized courthouse. This is actually Granbury, Texas, which is near the North Texas area. And this is a place where people go for theater, they go for festivals, they shop, they dine. And this is more the type of development we're looking for. So a mix of different uses all in the same place that's oriented to the pedestrian. We also have to think about how we organize this. And right now, what we have with our traditional suburban areas is we have very segregated spaces. So this would be a residential area of one size. This is a residential area with homes of a different size. And then you have different types of commercial uses over here. And what's interesting about this is if you have some grandparents who are living in this home on this lot, and then you have the kids and the grandkids in this area on this lot, then in order to cross this creek, let's say, to get from this lot to this lot, they have to get in their car and then drive around their neighborhood, come out to a main street, over, up another street, come back around, and then come to that lot. When they're really only just a 200 feet from each other, maximum. So again, oriented only to the car and not necessarily to the pedestrian. But then if you were to come into a more connected type of scenario, like what is being proposed by the Congestion or urbanism in this presentation today, is you would have, let's say, the kids and the grandkids living in this home, which is going to be a bigger lot, and you have the grandparents who are living maybe over here in a smaller lot home because they don't want to take care of as much land, or they might not want to have land property at all. And they would come over. The grandparents could walk, bicycle. The kids the same way, come over, and then just get to their family without even using a car. They could use their wheelchair if they have to. So it's all about not just the size of areas, not just the mixed uses, but also the connectivity. So you want to have a lot of connection points in the street. So you can see here we have very few, but here there's intersections and connections between streets all around. What we're also seeing is the way that the development is organized. We have here just like a lot of stormwater control that's surrounding. We have a few green spaces, but here we have a large amount of green space altogether for air purification, for water purification, for stormwater management, parks for recreational use, that access to nature that's critical. There's a scientist named E.O. Wilson who has written on the necessity to the human psyche of that experience with nature and how the connection with nature really has an impact on human happiness. So what we're looking at is pedestrian-oriented development, thinking about how people use the space, not in their cars, but on a personal level, on an individual basis. What's interesting about this, I love this picture right here. This is actually a walking school bus. So when you're thinking about how to get your kids to school, you know, when you talk about obesity rates, when you get out and walk, bike, it's going to make the population more healthy and also reduce healthcare costs. We also want to look at multimodal transportation and all types of transportation use. So you do have cars. We don't reject the car in this scenario, but we also look at other ways to transport people. Light rail, trolleys, bicycle, walking, however you want to get around, having options. So that if you want to drive your car, absolutely, drive your car. But if you want to get there in a different way, if you want to ride your bicycle, to have that infrastructure there as well with bike lanes. And there's actually, in Dallas, there's a great bicycle plan that's under development and is already being implemented. What we're also looking at is designing for flexibility. So when you think about how to build our buildings, to have a big box store, for example, that big box store is going to be oriented to the automobile on the side of a highway, let's say. And then whenever that store closes down or moves locations or wants to relocate, that space is left with very few types of uses that it could be. We've seen them develop into churches. We've seen them develop into paintball. Sometimes I've seen it develop into movie theaters, which are options. But whenever we think about how we can design these spaces, thinking about that flexibility when designing buildings. So with this one, we have a retail space below. It would go, off to the side. This is the West Village development in Dallas. The Dallas area rapid transit light rail. You can have several of these spaces adjacent to each other and have Best Buy or a Target in there. If the Best Buy or Target, let's say, would relocate then we can split this into smaller spaces and have a hair salon or a retail store. And again, if those spaces are closed, you can move in a bank, or you could even make that into a residential space. And here we have residential and office above. If the office closes, maybe we can translate that space into residential or studio spaces for artists. So it's thinking about flexibility as you build a space instead of building for one use and having to completely rethink development of that space for the next 10 years. And when we're also looking at how to develop for pedestrians, we want to think about how to calm traffic so people feel safe on the road. And there's lots of different devices that can be used for that. There's curb bump out. There's different ways you can route traffic around that makes people slow their cars psychologically, not necessarily using just speed limit signs. What's interesting about these types of things as well is these are all areas for vegetation and nature. So when you think about low-impact development strategies to incorporate stormwater into the development design, you can use those areas for infiltration of stormwater or for rain gardens and things like that that can be amenities to the development rather than eyesores. Street trees are also another way to calm traffic and slow drivers. And it's another psychological mechanism to use where if you have right-of-way and you have street trees on both sides, you automatically slow down a little bit with, when you add on-street parking, again, people psychologically slow down a little bit more because it adds that level of uncertainty. You don't know if somebody's going to walk in between those cars, and you want to make sure that you don't hit anybody. So another aspect of using street trees is it gives the pedestrian a sense of security. So when you have this, you're walking along next to the building with trees between you and the street, you don't feel as exposed as you would, say, walking through a large parking lot into a retail establishment. We also want to look at access to different services, being able to get to a farmer's market or restaurants or shops on foot or on bicycle, getting out and meeting people in your community and feeling that there's a sense of community by getting to know the people around you. When you live in an area where you get in your car, go to work, see your coworkers, get in your car, go home, there's a lot of people who can really live for long periods of time without talking to their neighbors. We also want to look at access to jobs. So whether it's building residences next to a train that goes to a job center, or putting office spaces or jobs that are attached to residential areas, so those things can intermingle so people can get to work and get home very easily and in multiple ways. When we're talking about the aging population, we're also talking about what type of housing stock we have. And when you're looking at sustainable development patterns, and we have zoning for lot sizes currently where you have a single-family home with a 7,000 square foot lot versus a single-family home with a half-acre lot, all grouped together in large tracts of land, then if you have, that may be acceptable for a family of 4 or 6, but whenever the kids grow up and graduate from high school and want to move into a different space, they have to typically leave that neighborhood, leave that town in some cases, to go and set out on their own. On the other hand, you have people who are maybe empty nesters, and in order to downsize, again, they have to leave the community. So in order to keep these communities intact, we want to have the diversity of housing stock. So we want to have an option in the same area of townhomes, of single-family homes, of more bungalow-style housing, an option of pricing so that different types of people can move around, because obviously an 18-year-old moving out of the house is not necessarily going to be able to afford the bungalow that the empty nesters are going to have after they've lived their lives in social retirement. So any type of diverse housing stock is going to keep those people close together, so that instead of having to move to a different community, that person who moved out of their parents' house, can visit their parents or their grandparents very quickly and easily in their own community, so that community remains intact. We also want to look at making these housing developments pedestrian-oriented with sidewalks and front porches. It's interesting because front porches, again, have a psychological connection to the street, where if you have a front porch and you're sitting on your front porch, it's your secured space, but you may say hello to your neighbors as they go past. There's neighborhoods in Dallas where they'll have porch parties, and they won't necessarily invite anyone from the neighborhood, but everybody comes and congregates on the porch because they'll walk by and join the party. And that's just a way to create that sense of community. And so here we have this pedestrian-oriented house with the front porch that also has efficiency benefits to the home because it's shading from the sun. And then here we have more of a typical suburban home, which is, again, oriented for the car, where you enter and you have a garage and a large driveway, and it's basically made around that vehicle instead of around the person who's living in the home. So we also have infrastructure improvements that can benefit the ecosystem services that are important to survival and happiness. And one of the ways we can do this is through adaptive reuse of existing projects. Again, this is sort of back to that designing for reuse, designing for flexibility. And this building is the South Side on Lamar residence. It used to be a Sears and Roebuck warehouse in the south side of Dallas, and has since been redeveloped into apartments, and has retail and studio spaces on the ground level for artists and residents. And it's really been a launching point for the neighborhood that is called the Cedars in Dallas. It's become an artist neighborhood. It's been a launching point for development in that area, to really bring that area up and increase the tax base of the city of Dallas. Another aspect of that infrastructure is to look at tree preservation. Tree preservation, whenever you think about the champion trees, heritage trees, any tree with any significant cultural value is important to save. But it's also important to look at existing tree stocks and to preserve as much as you can, because those trees do provide that connection to nature, and they also increase property value. So if you clear cut an area and plant new growth trees, then it'll take longer for that value to build as those trees grow. But when you have large growth, old growth trees in neighborhoods, the property value will be maintained. Also, a sense of open space should be included in new developments and redevelopment areas. Again, back to that connection to nature is very key, but it's also important to manage stormwater and provide habitat, providing these ecosystem services like air purification, water purification. You could provide the provisioning services such as community gardens, so you can include that agriculture aspect into your development, and also teach kids where their food comes from, and teach kids how to grow and have that connection to the land. It also, providing open space also is an opportunity for incorporating stormwater management, habitat. This is on the right here. This is a rain garden that's been developed to hold and infiltrate stormwater, but also provides habitat and an amenity to the community. So looking at ways to bundle the services in areas that can provide little pockets of nature, but also provide all kinds of other ecosystem services like the air purification and the water purification. Here we have a green rail line that, again, erosion control, stormwater infiltration, those sorts of services are being provided. At the same time, you have rail service. Again, looking at heat island reduction with vegetated roofs, vegetated parkland and things like that to cut down on the energy consumption of the buildings that are in the area. And then to counter the centralized energy model, energy grid, looking at distributed energy. So if you place energy where people use it, you save that component of transmission loss and have a more secure grid because you have areas that are all across town that are making their own energy as well as using the energy to the grid. So you're feeding into the grid and creating your own energy at the same time as well. This distributed energy concept also provides an opportunity for combined heat and power and district heating and cooling. So you have here on the left is power generation facilities at the combustion facility that also uses the waste heat to heat the surrounding buildings. So anytime you have this synergy of opportunities so that you have the waste heat going to serve buildings, you don't have to use that additional energy to heat buildings. You can also use what's called tri-generation, which is using that waste heat to power cooling. So you're using what's left over to make the surrounding area more comfortable and saving that energy in the end. Well, this is One Branch Place in New York, and they have a combined heat and power facility in their basement, and that facility actually heats the entire building. It's extremely efficient. And these kinds of facilities are used in many places in Europe, and they are tried and true. A lot of the pushback, it seems, for energy production in populated areas is kind of that not in my backyard NIMBY approach, where we don't want a power plant in our neighborhood, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an unattractive plant. So it can be incorporated visually into the space as well. So then, how is development sustainability measured? And there are a couple of different rating systems I'm going to talk about. Namely, LEED for neighborhood development, again, developed by the U.S. Green Building Council in association with the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Congress for the New Urbanism. So this looks at the neighborhood in three different ways. It uses smart location and linkage, neighborhood pattern and design, and then the green construction technology. And what that's looking at basically is splitting out these different organizations into the goals of the different organizations in these three different categories for metrics. So sustainable location and linkage is going to be about where you're locating your building, your impact on agriculture and floodplains and habitat. Neighborhood pattern and design is going to be more about how you organize communities around connectivity and walkability and that personal experience. And then the green construction technology is going to be more about how the buildings are made. That it's more like the traditional LEED program for energy and water efficiency of the structures and stormwater management and those sorts of aspects. It's developed on a 110-point scale, and you have 4 different rating certifications. So you have silver, You have certified silver, gold, and platinum. Another rating system developed around these issues, developed specifically around ecosystem services, is the Sustainable Sites Initiative, and this was developed by the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and the U.S. Botanical Gardens. And so this looks at mainly the ecosystem services and the site issues with less impact on the building and the specific construction of it. It does have construction aspects, however. So this is measured in site selection, pre-design assessment and planning, which includes a very detailed site survey that looks at existing vegetation, habitat, soil health, and is very intricate and is a requirement of the system, which I think is quite fascinating. It also looks at the site design of water, soil and vegetation, material selection, and human health and well-being. What's interesting about the soil and vegetation specifically is it looks at soil health and the biology of the soil and the fertility of the soil. Now, the material selection, human health and well-being, is going to be more about what the buildings are made of, the efficiency of the building, and then the human health and well-being has that specific connection to nature. It looks at construction impact on the site, but it also adds another measure of operations and maintenance and landscaping policies and how that site is operated. Another aspect that differentiates the program from the Lead for Neighborhood Development is that it includes a portion for monitoring. So how you're measuring how that site is performing against benchmarks, against your expectations for stormwater control, and how that area is being used as habitat. So, and this is also a 200-point system, and you can get anywhere from 1 to 4 stars as your certification level.